Good afternoon, dudes. This is Mr. Mark Ward, and this is our first in a series of lectures devoted to our unit on World War II. As you are following along, make sure you are completing the fill in the blank notes that I have provided for you. And then also that you were answering the questions that are on the left-hand side of the sheet. So this lecture is America Enters World War II. And again, some of this may be review for some of you guys. A lot of this stuff is covered in world history, but unfortunately, I do have to cover this again. So make sure you're following along. If at any time you need to pause it, feel free to pause it, whatever. Won't be offended. And if you actually just want to skip through it, you can do that as well. But just know you'll be responsible for knowing this information when it comes to the test. All right, so let's begin. So the first thing I wanted to show you guys is the two cartoons from, I'm sure you can guess, it's Dr. Seuss. He was a renowned cartoonist during World War II. And if you look at the first cartoon on the left, it's depicting looks like a woodpecker, and he's pecking down trees, and the woodpecker has a swastika on it. It's sort of representing Germany, and all the trees are different countries. The next one on the left, or sorry, right, it says, "And the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones, but those were foreign children, and it really didn't matter." So this is a cartoon sort of poking fun at the United States' stance on things going on in Europe prior to the U.S. involvement in World War II. So the U.S., as the war sort of rages on, remember the war starts in 1939, but the U.S. wants to remain neutral. So they do this 2 days after Britain and France declare war against Germany. President Roosevelt declares that the United States is neutral, so they do not want to be involved in anything having to do with Europe. Remember, World War I was a pretty bad experience for most of the participants, so the last thing anybody wants to do is get into another war. But also, remember, the United States is is suffering from the Great Depression. So the United States also needs money. So the United States passes one act in 1939 known as the Neutrality Act, which allowed warring countries to buy weapons from the United States as long as they paid cash. And they carried their arms away on their own ships. So if Britain wanted some tanks from the United States, they would bring in crap ton of cash, and then they would actually have to transport it on their own ships back to Britain. But President Roosevelt uses a loophole in the Neutrality Act of 1939, and he ends up sending 50 destroyers to Britain in exchange for the right to build American bases on British-controlled islands. So that's going to be sort of a big deal, sort of after World War II. And the the stance on being neutral wasn't limited to just the government. It was sort of urged on the part of all of Americans during this time. The Americans did not want to get involved in another war. There was a committee called the American First Committee, and they opposed any uh, American intervention or aid to the Allies. But Roosevelt is reelected to a third term. He's the only president to serve 3 terms. And his primary goal after his third election is to help Britain and the Allies defeat Germany. And he expresses this goal in what is known as the Four Freedoms speech. This is one of the most famous speeches that has ever been given by a president. It was basically an expression of the president's vision on American ideals of individual liberties that they thought should extend to the rest of the world. And Norman Rockwell, as a famous artist during that time, he raised over $130 million for war bonds. And he did this by painting depictions of what the four freedoms were. In this speech, he also proposes what is called as the Lend-Lease Act, where the United States will become what is known as the arsenal of democracy by reinforcing Britain. And he says this by saying, "We Americans are vitally concerned in the defense of freedom. We're putting forth our energies, our resources, and our organizing powers to give you the strength to regain and maintain a free world. We shall send you in ever-increasing numbers ships, planes, tanks, and guns. This is our purpose and our pledge." So the Lend-Lease Act, which is an important idea to know, says that the United States could lend or lease any arms to any country considered vital to the defense of the United States. This could be either Britain, and the Soviet Union at the time, and this act is passed by Congress. President Roosevelt also develops what is called the Hemispheric Defense Zone, which declared the western half of the Atlantic part of the Western Hemisphere, and therefore neutral. So this allowed Roosevelt to order the U.S. Navy to patrol the Western Atlantic Ocean and reveal the location of German submarines to the British. If any of you guys have seen the movie, I'm totally drawing a blank, but it's the movie where the guy breaks the Enigma machine. Anyway, this was based off of the Hemispheric Defense Zone. In 1941, August, which is going to be 4 months until America declares war, President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill agree on the Atlantic Charter, which ensures a post-war world of democracy, non-aggression, free trade, economic advancement, and freedom of the seas. America was not entirely neutral. Uh, a German U-boat, which is a German submarine, fired on an American destroyer, and they the American ships switched to a policy called shoot on sight. During this time, Japan is also seeking an empire, which is conflicting with the U.S. goal of remaining or maintaining an open trade policy in Asia. Remember the open door policy from imperialism unit that we learned first semester? This is sort of goes against this idea of the open door because Japan is trying to seek out their own empire. By July 1941, Japanese aircraft posed a direct threat to the British Empire. So remember, the United States gets British islands or gets bases on British controlled islands. The rise of the Japanese Empire sort of threatens these uh, islands. So the U.S. responds by freezing all Japanese assets and reducing the amount of oil and steel shipped to Japan. So they place an embargo on oil and steel on the Japanese Empire. The resulting embargo leads to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Not only do they attack Pearl Harbor, but they also attack the British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia. This includes Vietnam, which we'll learn about later on, and they seize the Philippines. There's another political cartoon by Dr. Seuss called The End of the Nap. Prime Minister Tojo, or Emperor Tojo, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, has famously said after the attack that he feared all that the Japanese Empire did was to awaken the sleeping giant. So that is in direct reference to the United States. So why did Japan pick Pearl Harbor? Pearl Harbor is in Hawaii. Remember, Hawaii is not a state yet. It doesn't become a state till 1948. But it's the place that they could hurt the U.S. the most. Most of the entire Pacific naval fleet was at Pearl Harbor. And plus, the Japanese army felt like invading the mainland of the United States, which most likely would have been like Los Angeles and other parts of Southern California. They thought that that was going to be too dangerous for the Japanese army. So there's some pictures of the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's one of the ships. If any of you guys have been to Pearl Harbor, you can still see some of the ships that are sunk in the harbor. A lot of them are still leaking oil to this day. And most of the people who died in the ships, their bodies are still in the ships. So remember, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor December 7th, 1941, uh, sinking or damaging 21 ships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, killing 2,403 Americans and injuring hundreds more. The next day, President Roosevelt declares or asks Congress to declare war on Japan. And then on December 11th, 1941, Japan's allies, Germany and Italy, declare war on the United States. So this is an excerpt of his FDR's famous Pearl Harbor speech. And the death toll from the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan lost less than 100 men. They lost 29 planes, 5 midget submarines. Midget submarines are essentially tiny submarines that usually house 5 to 6 people. And the United States lost 2,400 men, 1,178 wounded, 188 ships or planes, and 18 ships, 8 battleships, 3 light cruisers, destroyers, other vessels. All right, so that is it for my speech or my lesson today. We will do this activity the next time I see you. Thank you for watching.